Welcome back in here to Live Now from Fox. I am Andy Mack. We're continuing to follow the latest details now 4 days into this conflict in Iran following Operation Epic Fury early on Saturday. And right now we're learning President Trump saying in the Oval Office and also to several reporters that Iran is decimated, saying they're running out of different weapons. A live look right now at the White House here on this Tuesday evening. Let's be joined right now by Politico White House correspondent Sophia. You spoke on the phone for President Trump very briefly, talking about what's going on in Iran. What can you tell us about this conversation? What did he say directly to you?
Look, he told me that Iran was running out of launchers. He also, seems very confident about the weapon supply that the U.S. has, saying that he has unlimited. But he also told me something that's very key, which is he said, we'll save it and we'll build it. He said that U.S. defense companies are under emergency orders to restock the U.S. weapon supply. He did not specify which ones or provide any evidence to show that Iran was running out, but presumably he's been briefed on something specific as Iran running out of launchers.
Yeah, and we talk a lot about the timeline, how long this could last, because President Trump has said the projections at 4 to 5 weeks, and those armaments can only last so far. Did he give you a specific timeline at all?
He did not. He did not give me a timeline. And he also said at a separate, unrelated Medal of Honor ceremony yesterday that it'll take however long it takes. That's fine, which really tells you that right now the administration doesn't know when the military operation in the Middle East will end. And today, at the same time, the U.S. is essentially evacuating Americans from all of the Middle East. We're talking about 9,000 Americans who are still left in the region that the U.S. government or citizens are finding ways to evacuate themselves. They will have to find a way to leave the region.
Yeah, that is very concerning for so many in there. I think it was the figure was about 9,000 already getting out. I do want to ask you about the objectives and potentially what comes after, what's happening on the day after this unfolds. Does President Trump have any sort of plan in there? And regime change is not a part, apparently, of these objectives. What do they hope in terms of who's in charge in Iran?
Look, I spoke to President Trump this morning about this as well, and I asked him, Mr. President, is it too late for you to want to work with surviving members of the regime? And he said, no, it's not too late. He did mention that 49 Iranian leaders were killed in those strikes that happened this weekend. But he said that some of the people who were left, he would still work with, that, of course, it's not so late. And he said, quote, some of them would be really good. So, this is an indication that the president doesn't want regime change, but he wants, as one of my colleagues, Nahal Tusi, put it, he wants regime behavior change. He wants a regime, that, in his words, he wants the regime to be more cooperative. He wants it to be less extreme. But he also acknowledged today that there is a scenario where the people who do take over are just as extreme as the supreme leader that the U.S. and Israeli strikes killed this weekend.
Yeah, and potentially they also took out someone that President Trump, the White House, thought might be able to replace the Ayatollah there in Iran. You mentioned, though, the evacuation as the State Department saying to individuals in those regions in 14 some odd nations to depart now. What is the plan from the White House, from the State Department about getting people out? Because there's also issues with airspace closures.
So most of the airspace is closed. The State Department put out a hotline for American citizens to call if they were in the region. But as of today, if you call the hotline, the first thing you hear is a message to say, do not rely on the government to get you out. After questions about this message that people on the other end were hearing, the State Department did say that it was starting to organize charter flights to help Americans out. But, as of now, we don't know exactly what the timeline or the specific procedure is to get those Americans out.
Yeah, obviously, this could still unfold for quite some time. They're working to make that happen. You only spent about 4 minutes on the phone with President Trump today talking about this Operation Epic Fury, what's going on in Iran. What questions didn't you get to? What do you hope to answer potentially in the coming days if you have a chance to ask him again?
Well, I'll tell you about one other piece of our conversation. I asked him if he wants Iran to come and play in the World Cup that the U.S., Canada, and Mexico is hosting. And right now, Iran is scheduled to be in 3 matches in the U.S. And the president said, I really don't care. He repeated it twice. And, it is a pretty striking remark from someone who likes to be the consummate host. He loves to have sports as the thing that brings people together. And I think it's a reflection of his mindset and where he is with the regime right now is that, perhaps the World Cup is not top of mind. And I guess he doesn't care if Iran comes. I should mention, when it comes to FIFA has been putting together this workshop that is happening in Atlanta for all of the qualified teams, and Iran did not send any representatives to Atlanta to attend that conference.
Yeah, that is interesting to know. And obviously from Politico, from you talking about this thing, I don't really care if Iran plays in the World Cup. The United States, along with partnerships from Canada and Mexico, hosting it. And that's just 100 days away or so of those games being played. Obviously, they are in the West Coast. What else are we going to watch? Because we know there's a war powers resolution potentially brought forth in Congress. Plenty of pressure over what's going on. People obviously disagreed with what went on in Afghanistan and Iraq. How much pressure is on the White House, this administration, to try to get this done quickly and avoid any boots on the ground?
A lot. And let me tell you, Andy, it's coming not just from Democrats, but it's coming from conservatives too. And we saw yesterday the president really get very frustrated with people like Megyn Kelly and Tucker Carlson who have raised questions about the administration's strikes. Every day I think that the White House feels more and more pressure to sort of explain to the American people why they have entered this war. And in a midterms year, that's going to be something that is very key if you're senior leaders at the White House. One other thing to watch for is what's going to happen with oil prices. Right now, a lot of the tankers, they're not moving through the straits that they have to get to for oil to get out of the country. That is putting a huge dent on oil prices and causing it to rise. I think the administration is trying to find creative ways to solve this issue. One other thing is what's happening with marine insurance. These insurance companies are starting to cancel the insurances for these tankers and these big ships that are moving through because of the war. It's such a big risk. And I think there's a lot of pressure on the government to find ways to sort of fill in that insurance gap.
Yeah, a lot of different complications, the World Cup, those oil prices surging, and much more. Sophia Kai with Politico, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate your insight here on Live Now.